Welcome. Welcome to this session that's entitled Indigenization Destroys Academic Freedom. And it's part of a continuing investigation of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly at the University of Lethbridge. This issue has been going on for some time. And of course, it will involve looking into the people that are running the University of Lethbridge. One interesting feature that will come up is the idea of DEI and all of the impact that has on the freedom of speech. It affects what students, what faculty can say, and I think by extension, it affects what they are allowed to think. Now, first, I want to introduce Dr. Tony Hall. My name's Dave Garrett, by the way, and I'm here as moderator. I think I'll have more to do at the end when we have some questions and answers and some discussion. So we want one person talking at a time. I'm going to introduce Dr. Hall. He came to Lethbridge in 1990 to be an associate professor, excuse me, of Aboriginal Studies.
Native American Studies.
Don't quote me. He spent 26 years doing research and teaching, and then what happened to him is very similar to what happened to our featured speaker here today, which Dr. Francis Widdowson, who was at Mount Royal University in Calgary. Dr. Hall has published a couple of major works. They're here on this table. You could do some weightlifting with each of them. And he's also published hundreds of articles, one of which I was just looking at on Indigenous residential schools in Canada. He had some interesting experiences at the university, and after some court action, went back there and started what is known as globalization studies. Next September, the coming September, there will likely be a similar presentation as to this one, and the focus of that will be on Dr. Hall's case. It will focus on his experience with our local university. And he is going to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Francis Widdowson. So, Tony?
Thank you very much. And there's some technical parts in the chronology that weren't quite right, but it's a big learning exercise for all of us. And I've been learning a lot about Dr. Widdowson. And it's quite a revelation, and it's renewing the fact that I came here as a professor of Native American Studies. I remember when I applied for the job, Leroy Little Bear waiting for me in the airport. You're going to know his name well by the end of today. And I'd love to see a debate between Leroy Little Bear and Dr. Francis Widdowson. When I first met Francis, I had not been following her career, and I was working on my own things, and Native American Studies was an issue I was looking at, globally, Indigenous peoples globally. In any case, I heard there was this interesting case, so I went to the event, and I can see that several people here were at the event, and it was memorable in a very upsetting way. It was not the kind of scene that you would expect to see in a university, in an institution of higher learning. It was all about spurning and silencing and trying to overpower the speaker, the invited speaker, Dr. Widdowson, who was deemed to be by the Department of Indigenous Studies, as NAS was then called, something called residential school denier. And it seemed that the professors in liberal education, that they'd been talking about this very heretical person, and students were very revved up to make it clear that she was not welcome and that she would not be accepted if she tried to give a public presentation in the public space. Professor Viminitz, who's with us now, had invited Dr. Widdowson, and Dr. Widdowson was welcomed by the president of the university, but then had become subject to a real press of political influence, and he reneged on that invitation. Dr. Widdowson came in any case. So Helena, my wife there, she and I were there early and not really sure what to expect. And there was a group coming around handing out buttons saying, no place for hate. So this was how it was introduced. And these were, you know, lovely looking people, young looking people, bright looking young people who had a sense that they were on a mission to block out hate. And Dr. Widdowson became their idea of the hatred that had to be censored, that had to be contained, that had to be pushed to the edges, that had to be silenced, with like electric guitar that goes, oh yeah, as he tries to talk, with drumming and chanting, sacred chanting, which was, you know, I found it a little upsetting to see this sacred chanting directed in the way that it was. It was kind of a mob. It was a mob to silence a person deemed unworthy of human respect, let alone the capacity to talk in a public forum about a subject of her research, and that she has been, you know, articulate and facing a lot of persecution as a result of her ideas. I find some of Dr. Widdowson's ideas troubling to me. I guess you could see me going through PhD. I was very intent on the Aboriginal issues, that it seemed that this country, with all its promise, was not doing a good job with the sort of foundational issue of how we relate to Indigenous peoples. And lo and behold, I worked my way through a PhD. I got the PhD. I got a job in Laurentian University in Sudbury teaching Native Studies. And I got the call from Lethbridge, from from Leroy Littlebear, to join Native American Studies, which to me was the pinnacle. It was a great appointment. And I moved with my family, and here I am in Lethbridge to this day. So, so this episode has resonated, and Francis and I had dinner and met together the next night, and Francis was with Albert Howard, and Albert Howard is a big part of this story. Albert Howard is Francis's husband. She met him when she was around 25. Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and gorgeous and ready for action. And they teamed up in Yellowknife. And Francis had graduated from University of Victoria in political science. And so Albert Howard, I think, had a big influence on the fact that they became kind of socialists together, even dialectical materialist. Even there was influence of Trotsky, and there was this vibrant milieu of a very active middle-class professional working scene in Yellowknife, mostly doing Native programs. And people were making good livings, and you know, it seemed from that perspective to be kind of a good operation. but what was the effect on the people being administered to? And were dependencies being reified, being supported? So there came to be this concept that became her, the first major book that was discussed a lot, Aboriginal industry. And the idea that there has come to be a very large, well-funded, and elaborate set of businesses, and some private and some public, and lawyers and consultants. And let's not forget the make work projects in the prisons, because a lot of Indigenous peoples fill the prisons, especially in Western Canada. And that's a make work project. A lot of well-paying jobs are generated, and generated by some of the stark social issues that we see, walking around Lethbridge. It's pretty clear that there is a disproportionate number of the homeless people on the streets. Not all of them, but many of them are Native people. And this is not just unique to Lethbridge. So what happened? What's going on? So Frances did her PhD after she left Yellowknife. I think after you left Yellowknife.
Yes.
And at York with Leo Kanich, who is sort of Trotskyite in his orientation. And the focus was on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Now, by this time, I was ensconced in Native American studies, and I got a couple of contracts writing chapters for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. It was a very big enterprise, and I did end up writing an article about it called Blind Spot, which became the title of the book in which it appeared, where I began to question the Royal Commission. And so Frances was able to write a PhD thesis. Meanwhile, the book Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, discussions, that book was done before the PhD and then finished after the PhD. And that has generated a great deal of discussion. And it's been very polarizing. And there's no doubt that Frances Widdowson is a polarizing figure. People speak very highly of her and very appreciatively, saying politically incorrect things that are sort of seen as not with the party line, not with the government flows of money, not with the way the middle class develops itself. In fact, she's condemning it in ways that some people find very objectionable. In reading reviews, I found my friend Peter Kulczycki at Winnipeg writing about Frances in a very negative light, almost saying, you're not worthy to really be a good Marxist. Peter Kulczycki published in the Canadian Dimension, which I published in a lot. Saigonic, communist, runs that journal. This has continued. Then came more books, separate but unequal, Aboriginal knowledge and economic development. And I want to, humanize her story a bit, because at the University of Lethbridge, and in the way she's written about it in the mainstream media, you just utter this phrase, residential school denier, and that sums her up. That's all you need to know. She's a person with complexities. Interestingly, it's more the right-wing conservative branch of our political spectrum, our leadership pod, that has embraced Frances's work. And so, recently in December of 2023, this book, Grave Error, How the Media Misled Us and the Truth About Residential Schools, forward by Conrad Black. Now, many Canadians will know Conrad Black as a very prominent Canadian, a sort of Zionist media mogul. He used to own the Jerusalem Post. He started the National Post. But here he is writing the foreword, along with Tom Flanagan, who has been very supportive of Francis Widdowson. Tom Flanagan essentially invented what became the Harper government. It was an unusual thing that the Canadian government should move away from the Laurentian area of Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto, and kind of get a base in Calgary. And it was really Tom Flanagan, a professor at the University of Calgary. I mean, his students adored him. Ezra Levant, Daniel Smith, Stephen Harper. He really, his students all became prominent, and he was embracing the social credit heritage of Alberta, minus the anti-Semitism, because the social credit talked about bankers a lot. And so his idea was to invite David Frum and Ezra Levant to a conference in 1996 aimed at reinventing conservatism, away from progressive conservative to what we now have, the Conservative Party of Canada. So since the University of Lethbridge event, Francis is now widely acknowledged as a kind of pioneer of the 16 authors in here, representing a wide spectrum, very professional people, former judges, editors, journalists, well-known journalists. And she's now being recognized as one of the people that scouted out the fact that in 2021, the claim that mass graves had been discovered at the Kamloops Residential School was not really supported by the evidence. There was ground penetrating radar showing there's something buried in the apple orchard, but it's been how long now? A number of years, and we really don't have any evidence that this is really true. Now, of course, the residential schools have been a long time source of a lot of controversy, and very bad things happen in those schools in some cases. In other ways, some people like their experience in those schools and are happy for the education they were able to receive as a result. But this is a new concept, that if there are mass graves, there must be mass murder. And so this sort of changes the whole picture of Canadian history, if this is how the Indigenous people were being treated. And so we have the phenomena that the government of Canada, the Parliament of Canada, all the media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, many, many powerful instruments have landed on to the position that Canada has mass graves, and there was mass murder to fill these mass graves. Where did the bodies come from? And yet no evidence has really been reported. It's not to say that who knows what might be discovered in the future. This is a long way to introduce Francis, but Francis has become a very, very major figure. And we are really in a moment of contributing to history, because this is Lethbridge, where an event which I think has become notorious, which indicates there's something really wrong when a university devotes itself to blocking out speech, to preventing discussion and diverse opinion being expressed in a civil way, when this civility is replaced with a kind of ruthless cruelty. The person who ended up doing a lot of speaking was the security person, and Francis and a little group around her had to be kind of guided into tunnels and taken away from what was becoming a dangerous situation. There was a lot of talking from people who decided that they would describe their grievances and who really owns the land and this kind of thing. There's tapes of this. So here we are revisiting this issue at the University of Lethbridge. And then there came a month ago, or shortly, a little bit over that amount of time, at Winnell, a kind of book burning exercise where there was an effort to make the mayor resign, because his wife had been seen distributing this contraband, trafficking in books. We haven't seen a formal book burning, but there is the sentiment out there, that this will be seen as a seditious act of us talking about this, of presenting a forum to our primary speaker, Dr. Francis Widdowson.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you. Thank you. And thanks, Dave Garrett, for agreeing to moderate these proceedings. And as well, we have helpers on Zoom to deal with the question and answer period, which will happen afterwards. Scott McCloskey and Trevor Tomash are going to help us with the Zoom situation, and Stephanie, who's helping with the live streaming. So it's been quite a group effort to get here today. I'm amazed that it's all come together with all the technological moving parts. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. And this is a very, very important case, the University of Lethbridge, because although many people in Canada are perhaps not aware of the University of Lethbridge, we are suing, Paul Vemenitz, Jonah Pickle, a student, and me are suing the University of Lethbridge for violating our charter rights. And I think there's a good chance we will win that case. But if we do not win that case, this is a terrible precedent it's going to set for universities. But even if we do not win that case, I think that the public attention that we have obtained about the Lethbridge situation, the complete destruction of academic freedom that has happened at that institution, starting with the case of Anthony Hall in 2016, is really a canary in the coal mine for universities in Canada. So the time to fight is now, and we are marshaling forces to expose what is happening at universities through an examination of the University of Lethbridge case. So we've had a number of events already about the University of Lethbridge and what happened on February 1st, 2023. But what I would like to do is sort of go a bit deeper into some of the materials that got released. I believe it was in August of last year. So as part of the court case, which is going to be happening next year, we were able to get disclosure from the University of Lethbridge, where they released 260 pages of emails from the University of Lethbridge, which showed what was happening behind the scenes between about February, I guess it was about January 27th and January 30th or January 31st. And what it was all the pressure, tremendous amounts of pressure were being placed on the University of Lethbridge. And I wanted to just discuss some of those emails with respect to the University of Lethbridge case. But before I get into discussing those emails and what was the content of them in a very general way, you can look at them in more detail. They're available as the certified record of proceeding, which is on the wokeacademy.info website. So www.wokeacademy.info under the posting certified record of proceeding. That shows you the entire 260 pages, but I just wanted to talk very generally about the arguments. But before I get into that, I just wanted to briefly outline a few terms so that we can start off with a common understanding with respect to academic freedom, what is meant by academic freedom, and also the terms indigenization and decolonization. What do those terms mean? Because it's my contention that indigenization, which then morphs into decolonization, that is one of the main reasons why academic freedom was destroyed at the University of Lethbridge. So I wanted to just talk briefly about that before I get into actually what Paul Vemenitz has called the Widdowson affair which was the cancellation of my talk on February 1st, 2023. And then I can talk about the emails from the 15 professors, which are publicly available. And then an important statement that was put out by the Department of Indigenous Studies, which, although it is one page, I think it really summarizes everything that we need to know about indigenization. It's a very clear example of what we are dealing with. And then finally, I wanted to just end with a discussion of why academic freedom is important. One of the most disturbing things about what's happening in universities now is that the public doesn't seem to care about what's going on in universities. And I don't know whether it's because it seems to be quite intellectual and esoteric, not really pertinent to concerns that are happening on a daily basis, or whether they're just so fed up with the absolute nonsense that many professors are spouting these days. I don't know what it is, but if we lose our universities, we are going to have serious problems as a society. And I think the public needs to really realize that, and then join with professors like me and Tony Hall and Paul Viminitz and the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship to fight back against the forces at work which are really trying to destroy this very, very important institution. So in terms of academic freedom, which I just wanted to talk briefly about and just explain what it means and why it's so important, there's been a number of definitions that have been developed, and it really started at the beginning of the, I guess it was the beginning of the 19th century, where there were a lot of problems with corporations trying to control the ideas that were discussed at universities. And what happened is the American Association of University Professors in the United States and the Canadian Association of University Teachers in Canada had a number of conferences on this and came up with a very robust definition of academic freedom, which covers not only research and teaching, but also what's called extramural and intramural academic freedom. So your ability to criticize the university at which you work, that's supposed to be protected, and as well as outside expression. So expression when you're talking to the media or when you're on social media, those kinds of things are all supposed to be protected as well. And the reason why these protections are so robust is because you need to have a lot of latitude to try to pursue the truth in a number of different venues. And it might be slightly outside of your area of expertise because that allows for cross-fertilization to occur if you explore an idea that you're not, completely, you've done massive research on, but it's going to help you to understand the area in which you're examining. So the idea is that you should have a right to state what you believe to be true. And this should happen, and this is from the UNESCO definition that was developed in 1997, which the Canadian Association of University Teachers was involved with constructing, without constriction by prescribed doctrine. So that means that there should not be a predetermined idea that you have to align yourself with in the university. You should be able to challenge all ideas within the universities without having the university tell you this is the right way to think about something. And then there should be no institutional censorship. So there should be no university administrators canceling talks, for example. And so we can see how at the University of Lethbridge, there has been a complete violation of the principles of academic freedom because, as we will see, indigenization is actually a prescribed doctrine. So it's a predetermined view of how you should think about Indigenous issues. And as a result of that prescribed doctrine, that gave justification for the censorship, which was the rescinding of space. That's what happened, was the rescinding of space with respect to my talk. So this occurred because of indigenization. And this raises the question of what indigenization is and its fellow traveler, what's now called decolonization. And so, as Dave Garrett mentioned in his introduction, this is related to what's called diversity, inclusion, and equity programs, which is a complex topic in its own right. But indigenization is an aspect of diversity, inclusion, and equity types of initiatives, and it's part of inclusion, what's called inclusion. And the argument is that Indigenous people have been historically excluded from universities. And there's been a lot of discriminatory treatment of Indigenous people. And that's something we should recognize. No one is denying that there has been a terrible history of exclusion. So it has been proposed that there should be mechanisms developed so that Indigenous people can feel welcome in the university setting. And that's a good thing, is that, Indigenous people should feel welcome in the university setting. And there should be a number of programs that do this. And this is the positive side of indigenization. The problem is when that inclusion is developed through a lowering of standards for Indigenous people. And we've seen that happening in universities. All sorts of changes to various programs so that Indigenous people either don't have to meet the same entrance requirements as other students, professors, you have alternate tenure requirements, even proposals that they shouldn't have to write things down because Indigenous culture is an oral culture and therefore writing is not something that should be a requirement. These sorts of things, which is not helpful at all, because not only does it provide a lower standard of teaching and research for Indigenous people, it also creates a problem of the quality of the education in general in universities. And how we've seen this most, the most prominent initiative, which has resulted in this lowering of standards, is the promotion of what's called Indigenous ways of knowing. And the idea is that a way of knowing should create knowledge. So you have a method of some kind that allows you to develop knowledge within the university. But what we find with Indigenous ways of knowing is it's things like revelation. Various spiritual beliefs are promoted as a way of acquiring knowledge, or just the general memories that Indigenous people have, which in terms of this book, Grave Error, which Anthony Hall was talking about, in terms of the Kamloops case and the 215 anomalies that were found there, in addition to the GPR, there's a number of Indigenous people who remember stories about Indigenous people being buried in that apple orchard. And that is not a form of evidence that can be verified. So that, if you're going to say that the way of knowing, there's Indigenous ways of knowing that has resulted in this quote unquote knowledge of 215 children being buried in that apple orchard, that is not a rigorous way of determining whether that's the case or not. So to insist that this must be incorporated into the curriculum is going to have very serious negative effects on the university and the knowledge that's produced in the university. So indigenization could be positive, but it's often been turned into something which results in a lowering of standards. We've seen things become even worse than that in the last few years, however, with the morphing of indigenization into what's called decolonization, which is not about adding Indigenous perspectives and so on. It's about removing those views that Indigenous activists find to be offensive. And that is really the serious problem that we're facing. And in my case, as I'll show shortly, because of my views on whether or not the residential schools were genocidal, and I argue that they are not, they had many, many problems, caused a lot of harm. There was abuse in many residential schools, but to say genocide is to say the intentional extermination of a group of people, and that's not what was intended by the Indigenous residential schools. And also this idea of the remains of 215 children. I'm challenging that. I'm saying there's no evidence to support that being the case. These two positions, as we'll see, are found to be very offensive at the University of Lethbridge. And although I think that they are very valid positions, and I have a lot of many arguments to make to support them, it is argued that I should be excluded from the University of Lethbridge so that Indigenous activists can feel safe, comfortable, secure at that university. And that is not how a university should be operating in society today. And it's going to cause terrible problems for all universities if we are going to accept this way of proceeding. So that gives you a bit of an understanding of what academic freedom is, how it really comes up against how indigenization and then decolonization have come to be understood, because it involves indigenization has become a prescribed doctrine. So it is a view that you must accept, the views that are put forth by Indigenous activists, and that provides justification for cancellation, which is what happened in terms of February 1st. And so both constriction by prescribed doctrine occurred, as well as institutional censorship. Those two things occurred on February 1st, when Paul Viminitz invited me on, I think it was in November, to come and give one public lecture, and that was not on the residential schools. The lecture was on how wokeism, which is identity politics that has become totalitarian, the totalitarian form of identity politics. I was arguing that it threatens academic freedom, was my argument. I mean, it was in fact proven to be the case, because I could not even discuss that at the University of Lethbridge. So obviously wokeism does threaten academic freedom, because wokeism was the reason why I was not able to be able to give the talk, how wokeism threatens academic freedom. Anyway, President Mann, who he rescinded space for my lecture because of all the pressure. And the other thing that happened was that Vice Provost students, Kathleen Massey, I gave 2 lectures in Paul Viminitz's classes on whether or not universities should foster respect for Indigenous ways of knowing. And I was arguing that they should not officially. If individual professors want to teach that, that's one thing, but universities should not be developing this prescribed doctrine on this topic. Anyway, Massey sent out an email to all Paul Viminitz's students saying that they may be excused from my lecture if these classes will cause harm to you. And that view was backed up by the University of Lethbridge Faculty Association, which is very, very shocking that a faculty association would accept that. Both of those instances were a violation of Paul Viminitz's academic freedom, because Viminitz should have the ability to invite speakers to give lectures, and that was denied to him. And as well, it's up to Viminitz to decide whether his students should attend a lecture or not some administrator sending an email, which he did not even know about, to his students saying that they didn't have to attend. So those were 2 direct violations of Viminitz's academic freedom because of this prescribed doctrine of indigenization, which then of course morphs into decolonization. The reason why the public lecture, the space for that, was rescinded was because of all the pressure that was happening behind the scenes. And we just found out about this in, I guess it was August or September of last year when we got the disclosure because of the court case. And there are 15 professors who should just hang their heads in shame. They are totally acting against the academic mission of their universities. And it's quite shocking to read these emails. And in these emails, and this is all available on the wokeacademy.info site, as I mentioned, there were two arguments that were made as to why the talk should be canceled. The first argument was that my lecture was not academic, and they were claiming that I didn't use evidence to make my arguments. So my arguments were these kinds of crazy hate-mongering types of views that really had no place in an academic institution, which is absolute nonsense. And these people don't even read what I write anyway, so they don't even know what I'm arguing. It's just, it's comical. It would be comical if it weren't so tragic. That was sort of the minority position. The majority position was that although my views might be academic, there are higher values at the University of Lethbridge than academic freedom, which is a surprising statement in its own right, that the academic mission of the university wouldn't be the highest value at that institution. And there are three values that trump academic freedom. And these are protection from harm. So students should be protected from harm, and hearing my words spoken would cause them psychological harm. In fact, sometimes even re-traumatize them in terms of the trauma that they're experiencing. Hate speech is another argument that's made, that my views are hate speech and are therefore illegal in Canada. Peter Bowl wrote a very, very good piece in the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship newsletter in February 2024, where he dissects the claim about hate speech that was made by Carolyn Hodes, who is the most significant professor at University of Lethbridge in terms of the arguments that were being made. Many professors just sort of threw off a few lines here and there in their emails. Carolyn Hodes has seriously doubled down on her arguments in the journal, appropriately titled Feminist Asylum. And it certainly is an asylum, because it has completely irrational views that are being expressed in that article. And then we have finally the main other value, which I think is very, very prominent at the University of Lethbridge. And that is what has happened over the last 10 years or longer is building relationship with Indigenous communities. So the university has really taken this on, and they've gone into the communities and they've hired a whole bunch of Indigenous activists within administration. And because the Indigenous activists got upset about the talk that I was going to be giving, it would need to be canceled. Otherwise, those relationships would suffer. And that was a very prominent argument that was made in those emails. So that's in a very general sense what those emails said, but I highly encourage people to look on the wokeacademy.info site at the certified record of proceeding, which goes through about 260 pages of these emails. It's also very interesting to look at how the administrators responded to those emails. Did they say, hey, we're an academic institution, maybe you should consider and go to this talk and like see what the arguments are? No, there was all sorts of placating and pandering to these highly anti-intellectual arguments that were being made. So these violations of academic freedom, which were the rescinding of space for my talk and the Kathleen Massey email to Veminitz's students, why did these violations occur? Well, it's pretty apparent from the emails that it was because of the commitment to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And how, you're saying, well, isn't it about truth, and isn't reconciliation about, having sort of the interaction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples to find a better way forward? Well, truth and reconciliation don't mean what you think that they mean. Okay, so truth means relative truth. So the truth that someone believes. So what they believe to be true, if it's an Indigenous activist, that is truth. And reconciliation is basically listening to the demands of Indigenous activists. So there's no kind of back and forth and trying to figure things out. That's not happening. It's like you should submit to these arguments that are being made. And this has been pursued on a number of different levels. And Anthony Hall mentioned Leroy Littlebear. Leroy Littlebear is a huge figure at the University of Lethbridge, and he's been involved in the Native American studies initially from its inception in the 1970s. And he is basically a Blackfoot politician who is in the university and uses his position, his academic position, to put forward the activist position. And he has been involved in many initiatives at the University of Lethbridge. One of the most important early on, I believe that was in 2013, was the Blackfoot and First Nations, Métis and Inuit handbook that was produced, and that developed the territorial land acknowledgement. So that's in that handbook. More recently, he's been involved with what's called the Navigator 11 program, which was put into place with MasterCard. So it's a very corporate initiative trying to improve Indigenous participation in various corporate activities. Anyway, this latest development resulted in many Indigenous activists being hired in administration. And in the emails that were released, there's a whole bunch of discussion that was going on between Leroy Littlebear and the administration and this program, the 6 activists that were hired on this program, arguing that my talk should be shut down. So these activists played a significant role. Anyway, this territorial acknowledgement that was developed in 2013 is very, very important. And I have highlighted the sentence, or part of the sentence, that was used to sort of put forward the prescribed doctrine, and then that was used as the justification for the cancellation on February 1st. So we honor the Blackfoot people and their traditional ways of knowing. And that sounds very innocuous on its face, because people would say, just reading that, well, why shouldn't we, Indigenous people who've been here for thousands of years, we should really honor their place within Alberta, within Canada, and what's the harm in that? Well, it depends on how that's interpreted. And as we're going to see, it was interpreted in a way to prevent me from speaking on February 1st. So this appeared in the Department of Indigenous Studies statement. So the territorial acknowledgement appeared. I'll get to that shortly. But this is the first part of this statement, which was released, I believe, a few days before I was supposed to speak. And the whole department, so everyone signed on, supposedly. So a number of professors in that department, they basically denounced as a department. And the reason why they denounced me was because I did not accept the TRC's classification of the residential school system as genocide. That was the first reason. And secondly, I disputed the veracity of the unmarked graves. So that is very strange to happen at an academic institution. A whole department to come out to say that they're going to denounce me. I have my reasons for why I don't think the residential schools were genocidal. Same with the most prominent residential school historian, James Miller, who also argues the same. So I don't understand why that view should be prohibited at a university. And in terms of the veracity of the unmarked graves, I don't dispute the veracity of the unmarked graves. There are many unmarked graves in cemeteries. That is the unmarked graves. What there is no evidence for is clandestine burials. So burials which are done secretly because of some foul play which had unfolded and needed to be hidden. We have not one clandestine burial that has been substantiated in the across the country. And we need evidence of the clandestine burials. And what you see happen is when you have the conversation start about the clandestine burials, then you get diverted into a discussion of the remains that exist in cemeteries. No one should be surprised to find human remains in a cemetery. That is what cemeteries are about. And what's happened is the markers that were put over those graves have deteriorated. So now you have things like the Cowess's case, whereby, you know, the whole cemetery has basically been incorporated into what appears to be a soccer field. And that's where you saw Prime Minister Trudeau kneeling with a teddy bear. He was kneeling over what was basically an abandoned cemetery, which has been known for decades. It's not a surprise, but it got spun to indicate that it was clandestine in some way, which it was not. Cowess's, there's no even hint that those are clandestine burials. And then this is the second part of the Indigenous Studies statement, right, is that this territorial land acknowledgement, which has the sentence about honoring the Blackfoot people and their traditional ways of knowing, the Indigenous Studies Department gives us their interpretation of what that means. And that means that you must have a commitment from all faculty to ensure that Indigenous histories are represented safely. What does it mean to represent a history safely? Well, that means you shouldn't have a view of that history which is going to be upsetting to Indigenous activists. And that is not how academic institutions operate. Many times we have people who are invested in a particular view of history, and they become very upset when someone challenges that. That is the whole purpose of an academic institution. And then there's all sorts of claims about having to stand with Indigenous students and faculty, and that, you know, welcoming and acknowledging we have a commitment. So they're really putting a lot of pressure on faculty members to reject views with which they disagree. This is absolutely contrary to academic freedom, because academic freedom, you are not supposed to have this prescribed doctrine forced upon you. And this is exactly what the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Lethbridge is doing. So this entire statement is just an incredibly good example of what happens when a university becomes indigenized, is that you have all these activist pressures which are placed on the discussion of ideas. So that gives you a sense of how indigenization destroyed academic freedom at the University of Lethbridge. And now the question is, why should we care about that? Why is that just an absolutely terrible thing to happen at the University of Lethbridge? And things are happening, maybe not as in an extreme way in other institutions, but the same kinds of pressures are being mounted on those institutions. And the Supreme Court, in a case called McKinney versus the University of Guelph, just does kind of stress why this is important, is that in universities, we need to have the free and fearless search for knowledge and the propagation of ideas, and this is essential to our continuance as a lively democracy. So if we do not have this in universities, we are going to have serious problems as a society. And I think we are starting to see that a little bit. And with respect to my case, you know, the allegations about genocide, you know, this is a very serious business. If Canada was engaged in genocide, we need to recognize that. And we need to figure out what to do about that. But if we did not engage in genocide, then that's a whole nother conversation. So we need to figure out what the situation is. And we don't know what that is yet, because we have all these clampdowns on the discussions that are happening across the country. and then the veracity of the unmarked grades. It is May 25th today. 2 days from now, on May 27th, we come to the 3rd anniversary of the announcement by the Kamloops Band that the remains of 215 children had been found. That's what they said 3 years ago. At the time, I thought this was just a mistake because, you know, ground penetrating radar, no one knows anything about that. And, you know, maybe it's, you know, people just misunderstood. This is looking less and less likely. It is likely fraud, massive fraud that has been perpetrated against the Canadian public because millions, I believe it is about $300 million has now been distributed to try to do further investigations. The Kamloops Band, at the very least, needs to release the Beaulieu GPR report. So there's a report that was done on the GPR. They have kept that secret. That report was funded by the Canadian Heritage Department. We need that report released so we can look at the methodology that was used and whether Sarah Beaulieu stated in that report that the remains of 215 children had been found. My guess, she did not say that. And if she did say that, there's serious incompetence that occurred in that report. Second thing, besides the pursuit of truth, which is being undermined, professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, all the people who make things work in our society, they're not going to work anymore because then they will not have the knowledge to be able to understand how to provide healthcare, provide education, provide engineering, whatever needs to be done. That's going to be a serious problem. In fact, indigenization is an attack on the merit principle in universities. And finally, buttressing democracy. Universities are the first kind of line of defense against the increasing autocratic tendencies that are going on. As Anthony Hall mentioned, I went to Quesnel April 2nd to ask questions at their meeting after all the city council had denounced this book without having read it. And I wanted to ask them questions about that. And I encountered an unbelievable breakdown of local democracy in the city of Quesnel, and you can watch it, it's on YouTube, that meeting. It was just a disintegration of democratic principles. And that's what we're going to see throughout the wider society if we don't start fighting back right now and insisting that our universities protect academic freedom. Thank you very much.
You know, you need to debate things. People need to feel secure, saying things that might be unpopular, might be unorthodox, might be something that people have never heard before. We need places to discuss things, and it's not just a matter of who's the most popular and whose voice is going to prevail. You think if you're a professor and you come up with some finding that might disrupt a whole industry as it exists because it provides some new approach to making things or servicing things, the people in that industry are going to want to fight to protect their existing powers, economic viability. So there's all kinds of formula, there's all kinds of possibilities that by doing research, you're going to offend people in power. You're going to offend people with a lot of money and political clout. And so little by little, this idea that you have to have protection for academic freedom. Now we've seen with the coronavirus, where the government decided we're going to have lockdowns. And it wasn't one government doing this. All the governments were doing the same wrong things simultaneously, doing the same anti-science things. Oh, we're going to wear masks, which are not good for you. We're going to not do ivermectin. We're going to do mandatory jabs. Think of the University of Lethbridge. Mike Mon has dictated that in order to be a student or a faculty member at the University of Lethbridge, you had to take 2 shots, which were not tested, which don't even seem in light of what we know now to have anything to do with a virus. These were about genetic modification, mRNA, lipid nanoparticle. There was no debate in the universities. It's necessary. If we have a problem in society with free speech, with being able to disagree about things with civility. But that's what we have universities for. So if you have universities, but without academic freedom, what do you have? You have a place where political cronies get together and give each other favors and contracts and scratch each other's backs. You don't have a credible forum to decide what is true. And sometimes the things that are true are not going to be popular in the first instance, or not seem even familiar, or so this academic freedom, I want to stand for that. And I'm not here to be an advocate for Francis or not, or one way or the other, but I am here to be an advocate for academic freedom, as is Francis. And that's what I see is a big problem in all the universities. And this discussion of genocide is happening all over the world right now. And you will be very familiar with the reason that word has such furor around it. It's so volatile. This concept of traditional ways of knowledge, from reading about Frances in her days in Yellowknife, there was a time where a new diamond mine, BPH, they were wanting to get Aboriginal involvement in their project and permission for their project. And so this concept of traditional environmental knowledge became very much prominent. And what is that? Is it something that is sort of like a ribbon that you put on it with an Aboriginal design on the mine, on the diamond mine, and then it looks like you're doing the appropriate thing? So this question of the Aboriginal voice, like Leroy Littlebear has devoted a lot of his career to discussing what he calls Aboriginal science. Is science one thing? Like, there's rules for deciding what can be proven and what can't be proven and what the patterns are? Or is it a relative kind of thing that all societies have their approach to science? And, these are big questions. And, one thing I watched when I was there was this growing emphasis on Aboriginal science. And I have to say, sometimes you find yourself saying, well, where's the beef? Yeah, you can have the physicists come in and say, well, I'm doing quantum theory, and it reminds me, when I hear this Blackfoot story, it reminds me of that. It's kind of similar. But I think that's, Francis has been very pressing on that issue. And it's an important issue. And it's also important that we open ourselves to the reality that, say, in medicine, a lot of important patents come from people going into the Amazon and looking what the Indians use to cure things, getting a patent on it, taking it back and, getting rich. And Indigenous peoples have been cut out of the action in some of their actual Indigenous knowledge. These are complex issues. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. This genocide word, the genocide word, it isn't a very old word. It was invented in 1944 by a person called Raphael Lemkin. And he was in Eastern Europe. He's Polish, sort of a jurist. And he was noticing, as Germany became increasingly powerful, not only within Germany, but throughout Europe, that there were policies. And he was looking at largely cultural genocide, that certain groups of people, their libraries were being shut down, their theaters were being shut down, their schools were being shut down. And this was a way to favor some nationalities over other nationalities, or at least that's how he explained it in his book. He writes his book in 1944 and somehow shoots his way to New York and becomes the author of the Genocide Convention. So he actually invents the term, and you have to wonder if there was some arrangement going on here, that he invents the term and then suddenly appears as the main technician at the United Nations when it's just being formed, and he comes up with a convention, the Genocide Convention, which is being discussed a great deal now with respect to the government of Israel and Netanyahu and Hamas leadership. Actually, they're not using, the ICC is not using the word genocide, but the International Criminal Court is. I do believe that genocide is a pretty powerful idea, that Canada isn't in a isolation. There's a place called the Western Hemisphere, and where in 1492 there were Indigenous peoples everywhere, and their way of life prevailed. And then the Spanish came, and the Portuguese came, and the French came, and the British came, and it was pretty clear that very quickly the idea developed that this Western Hemisphere is going to be a place to receive immigrants. And the old Aboriginal way of life is not going to prevail. People are not going to learn the Aboriginal languages and learn to be Indians. That Indian people have been pushed to the margins in a hemisphere that since 1492, I think could be described as the scene of an intergenerational genocide. And for my part, I don't see the genocide discussion as being over because we can't prove what happened at the Kamloops residential school. I think it's an important idea. I did write, this was my last peer-reviewed article. I was long since out of Native American studies, but I took an interest in the residential school issues. And what I saw at the University of Lethbridge, as I was looking into what happened vis-a-vis Francis, was a very low-level discussion about what the case of the matter is. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was well-funded. An Aboriginal judge led it, and they came up with the idea that cultural genocide has taken place in Canada in these residential schools. And cultural genocide is a real thing, it's an important thing. Raphael Lemkin thought it was an important thing, the inventor of the word, but it's not a judiciable crime. The crime itself is in a very particular place. It's a bunch of text that is about this long. It's just a very few words, and the definition of what genocide is given, and Israel is being charged by the ICJ for 4 of the 5 points. The 5th point says forcefully moving the children from one group to another group is genocide. And that is what happened in Canada. And we can debate about how much compulsion there was, but after 1920, there was compulsion. You have to go to school. And and is genocide, do we just talk about after 1948 because the law didn't exist until then? Or do we read back genocide into history, because obviously the process is as old as the history of humankind. So in my view, the thing to do would be, as I express in this paper here, go to the United Nations, international law, and let's work it out. And there's similar issues coming up in Australia, different parts of the world. Maybe the United Nations is the place to deal with this, but they didn't do that so far. Murray Sinclair and the bunch, they took the money and they came up with the moderate statement that cultural genocide exists, and somehow now they're transforming it into full-fledged genocide. We'll just use the word genocide, which is against the law. It's against an international law. it's the Genocide Convention of 1948. And in my view, we fulfill that. And so I think I'm more extreme than the people at the University of Lethbridge who are, just pretending that the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are about genocide. No, it's about cultural genocide. So just to finish, I want to say, this DIE, this diversity, inclusiveness, and equity, this DIE, which is the policy of MIT is dropping it. People, little by little, they're dropping it. You no longer, when you put your application in for a job, have to tell all about your racial identity and everything, where it's being dropped. So did Francis Widdowson get diversity? Is like just skin complexion? Is that what diversity is? We've got a variety of skin shades. Diversity is also to do with ideas, religious orientations, ideological orientations. And the Frances Widdowson, her view of these things are part of a diverse array of opinions and theses on these subjects. Was she included? No, she was excluded, and almost violently so, almost aggressively so, forcefully so. She was, there was an inclusiveness and an equity. Well, if we're going to have quotas, how many Caribbeans do you have? How many trans do you have? How many? If we're going to do it that way, what happens to meritocracy? And isn't meritocracy supposed to be important? So I'm just going to finish by saying at this point that it's a long story, but I am Professor Emeritus at the University of Lethbridge. I am part of the faculty, and I am speaking to you from within the University of Lethbridge. And actually, I have this title, and it's got this word in it called emeritus. I got through my career, I got to the end of it, it's called professor, and that made me Professor Emeritus. So what I want to do is develop this investigation, of which my own case is one part. Who knows what's hiding in the woodworks at the University of Lethbridge? The University of Lethbridge is, part of a larger system, and universities all over the world are in chaos right now. And we're not doing well in, diversity discussion, civil discussion of things. So I just want to note that, well, when we talk about the administration, Mike Mann says this, Mike Mann says that. There's something called the Board of Governors. There's an administration, and when they write about, when Mike Mann writes to me and says, you have to do this and leave, and you're going to be a trespasser, and you can't use this and that, he's acting on behalf of the Board of Governors. And I tried to connect with the Board of Governors, and especially Terry Whitehead, who's now the Chancellor. And they have one email, governance@uleth.ca. That's the way you reach them. Who are these Board of Governors? As I say, they act in the name of the university. What are we, the faculty? Are we just employees? Somebody signing our check? No, we're supposed to be involved in the governance of the university. So this idea of getting some accountability, there's nobody here from the University of Lethbridge at all. This criticism can be ignored. I mean, they've got the government money coming into them, and they can ask other agencies for money. And what happens if the Board of Governors says, well, we're going to refuse to take seriously our responsibility as the fiduciary of academic freedom. We need to get money, and we've got people who are willing to contribute as long as they can control parts of the curriculum, as long as they have a say over who gets fired. And how can academic freedom be sustained in that? So I'm thinking there needs to be an outside investigation of the University of Lethbridge. This is part of a process that we could see as Alberta-wide, and that I want to stick with this. I'm Professor Emeritus. What does that mean? It means, well, this is a service to my university. I put many years of my life into it. I want the best for my university. I want to see that university get back on track. And why not? take this stage of my life and, put a priority on this. So I'm kind of making this announcement. This hasn't been part of the discussion up until now. It's the first time I brought it up. And thank you very much. And thank you, Francis, for your wonderful presentation.